If you've ever wanted a mentor, you need to know how to be a mentor. You need to do it right. Give this channel some love by pressing the subscribe button, kick back, and enjoy another conversation at the Myth Slayer Café. A quick note before we get started. While we were recording this powerful conversation, some nearby natural light was playing a little bit with my camera. But trust me, what was said during this interview is far more important than a little lighting weirdness. Enjoy a heck of a discussion with Summer Watson. We are back at the Myth Slayer Café, and I have with me today Summer Watson. You can read all about Summer in the captions below, and you're going to find out a lot more about Summer during our conversation today. Summer, welcome to the Myth Slayer Café.
Thank you, Scott. I'm so excited to be here and have a chat with you. Let's get right into this.
I love it. You know, we were talking beforehand, before I pressed the recorded button, and we were saying, you and I know how to talk.
Oh, we certainly do. That's why we have to carve out an hour and a half to 2 hours every time we do talk.
Exactly. So everyone watching, you're going to get some realness today. All right. Your homeboy and Summer Watson are going to have some fun.
We always do. We always do.
We do, especially when we talk about Greek myths, starting with the one we're focusing on today, the myth of the goddess Athena. Athena was the protectress of cities, in other words, of the dominant organizations that existed in ancient Greece. Athena was the favorite child of the chief god Zeus. Athena was born when Zeus's first wife, Metis, the goddess of prudence, accepted a dare by Zeus to turn into a number of different shapes. And one of the shapes that she turned into was a fly. Zeus was afraid that if he had a child by Metis, that child, if a male, would overthrow him, because Zeus himself had overthrown his predecessor. That's how he became the king of the gods. So he swallowed Metis. Metis was pregnant. She gave birth inside of Zeus's skull. Hyper-realism here. Yeah. And then Zeus started having these headaches, and eventually the blacksmith of the gods basically split Zeus's head open, and out popped Athena with a shout, fully clothed, an adult, already geared to go to battle, because she was also the goddess of strategy, particularly in war. She was the patroness of heroes, everyone from Odysseus to Hercules to Perseus, who we've talked about a couple of times on this show, and who was responsible for killing Medusa. She was the one who invented, in particular, crafts associated with what was considered at the time women's work, like weaving and things like that. She was a goddess that was wholly and completely committed to mentoring. So as the patroness of the heroes, for instance, she would help guide them. She would give them advice. And they, of course, recognized that as the goddess of wisdom, it was in their interest to listen to her. But interestingly enough, mortals who were younger and quote unquote inferior or lower down on the divine hierarchy than Athena weren't the only ones who listened to her. I mean, there were specific instances in which Zeus sought her advice as well. And that's interesting because the ancient Greeks and the Romans, they were a patriarchal society. They were saying something about men listening to women by having that role, but also they were talking about cross-generational mentorship, which I'm sure will come up a little bit later. And finally, Athena's symbol was the owl. Right? She started out originally as a goddess that we think was fully a bird. And in some early art, we see her gradually shedding these owl characteristics. The wings, I think, were the last sorts of remnants in artwork that we see of her retaining bird-like characteristics. But nonetheless, what she shed as physical characteristics as her personification evolved, merged into or became exemplified through this sort of icon or this motif that she was seen with everywhere she went. I've said a lot about Athena. She means a lot. She represents a lot. Why does she speak to you, Summer?
Well, I think she speaks to me for many reasons. She is full of wisdom. She sounds like, somebody who, yes, is an old soul, but at the same time really can identify with multiple generations. She's somebody who shares knowledge, who accepts knowledge, who is asked about her knowledge, right? So there's a lot of different areas here where Athena really resonates with me. She's a
Mhm.
strategist. You know, um, no, I wasn't swallowed by my father. I wasn't born in a
Thank God.
Did I crack my husband my dad's head o no, I didn't do that. I didn't have to come out of his head, but, I think it's a great story, and we all have stories, right? She has a background. She has a tough story. She's a woman in a patriarchal society, right? And yet she is still revered. She's still looked at highly. She's still needed for her wisdom and her expertise. She's still a strategist. So she overcame a lot as well. So I feel like when I look and hear about Athena, and even having the owl be a representation of who she is and maybe her inner spirit, right? Where she's shedding these leaves. I
Mm,
mean, an owl is representational of
yeah.
wisdom, of knowledge. I don't know if you remember, like, what is that, back in the 70s, Schoolhouse Rock?
I'm only 30, so I don't remember that.
Or even when what is those suckers? And it was like that commercial where the owl is a 1 and a 2, and he's wearing glasses, and he looks so formal and so, full of wisdom, and he's like, "Crunch."
I can't believe it. I actually do remember all of these things.
You remember?
Yes.
Okay. So those were some wonderful things because, again, it was about wisdom, it was about knowledge. Schoolhouse Rock, those commercials, the owl, and as she herself, Athena, starts shedding these feathers,
Mm,
she's coming into her own. And what does that mean? That means strength. That means wisdom. That means sharing. That means being a mentor. And those are some of the things that and also let me take a step back and also caring about her community,
yeah.
right? And those things really resonate with me. Those are things that are like, infused in everything I do. Do I care about community? Absolutely. Do I like to strategize about, how I'm going to support the community around me and other communities as well? Absolutely. I love that. Have I been doing it for a long time? Yes. Do I have, you know, uh, um, still an opportunity to grow with other people? Absolutely. And even though, I might have years of acquired and accrued wisdom or knowledge, um, there's opportunity to always learn from others, right? And I think that that is kind of representational of Athena as well. This is who she is. And I think that symbolically as well as practically, I, feel like I have a lot of those characteristics. So, what are your thoughts?
I am thinking about a lot of the symbolism within what you said, as well as within the evolution of Athena from an artistic and embodiment perspective. And then tying that into some of the themes that speak to Athena about you. For instance, you emphasized community. As we mentioned a few minutes ago, Athena was the protectress of the city. In other words, she was the protectress or the guardian of the city within which her temples were. The most famous one is Athens, which was named after Athena, and the world wonder of the Acropolis is dedicated to her on the top of that hill in the center of Athens. So you're talking about community. You're talking about mentorship, which is receiving and then passing on wisdom. You are also talking about, and you described this very interestingly and beautifully, the visual metaphor associated with the historical metaphor of Athena starting out as an owl with feathers, as she was originally envisioned, gradually losing those feathers and stepping into her own, and therefore being able to be, for instance, a strategist that she feels like she is inside, and some other things. Now, tying all of that together, I can't help but think symbolically of the feathers and the coming into our own as representing moving from the animal to the truly human. And what does moving from the animal to the truly human represent to me? It represents a foundational element that humans can aspire to, and if they're diligent, achieve, which is the shedding of, or the appropriate placing of, the animal ego. Then concern about things like community, concern about passing on wisdom, concern about a lot of these group-oriented and social-oriented things are able to come into play. You have an extensive psychology background, Summer. Talk to me a little bit about the role of ego, why it exists, and whether you think that ego has a place within organizational growth, within community building, and within strategy.
Well, I think that, ego was a term that was established. We all have it as humans. We all have an ego, right? We have an ego and super ego. And the person that put really the key terms together was Freud. And he talked about the subconscious, and even before Freud, we had philosophers,
Yeah.
right? That's really where psychology started out, is in philosophy, because we were asking these deep questions of why, and how, and what. And so there were many deep questions, and, people pondered these questions, and it evolved over time into these theories, into these practical applications. And Freud was one of those people. Everybody knows Sigmund Freud for who he is. He is the father of psychology, right? And so he developed these terms, the ego, the super ego. And so really it's about how we interact as humans. It's about that deeper level, that subconsciousness of what are we holding on to as we function and move through the world? How do we see the world? How do we envision ourselves within that world, right? And so where did Athena, as she developed, how did she see herself? Where did she see herself? And the ego, we all possess an ego. So to rid ourselves of that ego, I don't know if we can actually do that, but we can understand it better, right? We can understand it. We can learn about it, especially when it comes to how do we, not at where is our place, but more so, how do we function within
Mm.
community? And so the reason I studied many doctors of psychology, and that to include Sigmund Freud. But I also, one of his students, one of his peers was Alfred Adler. And I really, really, really picked up on Alfred Adler as I was a student moving through the phases of learning about psychology. And the reason why is Alfred Adler actually had the the power to say to Freud, I don't believe in everything that you do. I don't believe in that everything about human functioning and the way that we perceive or look through, look at the world
Mhm.
is all subconscious, or it's not driven by the psychosexual, right? Not everything. So he did a detour and he said, I'm going to kind of separate from your theories and your practice. And what I believe is that there are many reasons why people behave and think the way they do and have many different influences. But one of the things that he said, and he has a long German word for this, but he said, you know, people are driven by how they feel in their surroundings, in community, in society. And if they feel like a belonging
Mm.
or have that belonging, they feel more at ease, they feel more inspired, they feel like, just more
Mhm.
connected. And so that to me was extremely meaningful. So when I went to, when I started learning about Alfred Adler, I thought, that makes sense to me. And he then became really the father of modern psychology, of holistic and humanistic
Mm.
psychology. And so people saw him as that because he realized that behavior isn't just one thing, isn't based off of one thing. It's based off of multiple things and multiple influences. And so when I look at Athena as she's shedding her feathers, as she's creating her own foundation, and as she's coming into her own, I'm thinking she's shedding those feathers because this is a better understanding of who she is. She's coming into that. She's stepping into that.
Mm.
And she's shedding those feathers of conditioning, right? Being told it's this way. It's not this way. It's this way by maybe her peers, her clergy, those that brought her up, right? And she thought, or maybe she just stepped into her own and started creating that foundation of, this is who I am. I can shed what I don't feel I'm in alignment with and doesn't necessarily work for me. I can better understand it, but she got clear about who she was and how she was functioning and was what she was passionate about. So that's what I would say about, that understanding of ego and really where that drives us, how ego drives us. Is it in a way that it's hurtful to us and our person and our mind, or is it something that is actually helping us? And I think in some ways it can help us.
Mhm.
It's just like anything else. If we do too much of something, it might be overwhelming. It might be that particular nuance or factor or variable that takes over. And we see this with personality sometimes too. So, I can go down the road of personalities because there are a lot of different what we call personality disorders. But then we all have tendencies to be a certain way based on our own personality, right? And it's something that I had to look at early on too, because I thought about as I was shedding my feathers, I thought, How is my personality influencing where I'm at, where I want to be, how I function, how I'm getting along with others, how I integrate into society? What does that look like? Is that part ego? Is that personality? Are there other factors that are influencing that behavior? So when you look at Athena, I wonder, and you can maybe talk about this, Scott, but I wonder as she's shedding those feathers, if she's also asking herself those questions. I wonder if she also had that opportunity to do some self-reflection where she paused and thought, how do I want to influence others? How do I want to embrace others and their knowledge and their wisdom? What are your thoughts, Scott?
Well, my thoughts are that there are a lot of tables and different rooms in the Myth Slayer Cafe, and there are a lot of conversations that could go on at every single table and in every single room, and you've just started conversations in all of them. So I will start with this particular conversation. I will admit, said something that was kind of catnip to me, so I'm going to have to be like the cat grabbing at the catnip in a minute, and then I will take this to what I originally thought I was going to talk to you about. But Summer, you just opened up so many doors. I'm just going to have to find a way to weave my way back to that as using another one of Athena's skills. Let me go to the immediate, metaphor that you raised about Athena and the feathers. Sort of thinking about it, there is this school of thought. A lot of Stoics fall into this, but it is popular elsewhere, that the key to being able to live a fulfilled, successful life is to eliminate the ego altogether. Now, I have to say I've never understood that, because to me, if you don't have some ego or some sense of selfhood, like, how do you have boundaries between yourself and anything else? Now, if you're on psychedelics and you're trying to have a transcendental experience or a holotropic experience, yes. But like day to day at work, y'all want to have boundaries. You do. And not only that, but how do you even protect yourself? Like, how do you even say my life is worth living if you have no ego at all? And so when you're talking about Athena stepping into her own and releasing the feathers, I can't help but remember, although the physical manifestations that surrounded Athena went away, the owl stayed with her. It was just something that was smaller and constrained. So what I am thinking about when it comes to Athena and the feathers right off the bat is that understanding the role of the ego, not necessarily saying, okay, let me just have nothing that represents me or who I want to be in this world at all, and then let me lose my identity, might not be the course of wisdom. Because what, sort of taking your metaphor to the next level, I'm hearing is that the course of wisdom is to maintain that sense of selfhood, but within the appropriate sphere.
Yeah, I think you absolutely can maintain that sense of selfhood as long as you get a better understanding of what that is to you, what that means to you, right? And when you talk about ego and completely doing away with ego, I don't think that's possible, right? We all have a bit of ego. We all have personalities. Do we have what we used to call it access to? Do we have clinical personalities, personalities that are going to really interfere with our everyday functioning? No, I think many of us have tendencies, right? Tendencies to do A, B, or C, or to look or to perform or to do or act a certain way. And when we talk about ego, one of the things that you said is, can we completely, diminish or get rid of? And I don't think so. My correlation is this. So when you look at the amygdala, which is the back of the brain, right? And that is the area of the brain which really, it surpasses when we have a thought or when something scary comes in and we immediately get up and go and start running because we're either scared, frightened, startled, whatever. That surpasses our frontal lobe. It goes into the back of our head, into our amygdala. The reason it does that, it's a mechanism that allows for us to flee, to go away, to run, to keep ourselves safe, right? So even when we think about treating the brain, we don't want to diminish or completely the amygdala, because you need to have that opportunity to flee when you're in an unsafe environment. And so the ego is also helping you kind of monitor, manage, like you said, those boundaries, understanding self. I don't think you can completely omit the ego because I don't think it's safe.
Wow.
Just like you wouldn't do that with the amygdala. We don't go and put the amygdala to sleep and over medicate it, because you actually need the opportunity to keep yourself safe.
You actually just explained, I think, something that's been a lifelong mystery to me, or not a lifelong mystery, but a mystery of some number of years. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who's experienced something like this. On 9/11, I was quite close to the World Trade Center, and I actually, they opened up the pay phones on the street. They weren't charging people to use them. So I called up my spouse at the time and we basically talked about what was going on as I was looking at the World Trade Center burning, I don't know, however many blocks away, not that many. And I'll never forget it. I hung up the phone, and then there was this huge rumbling, and I started to see the top of the towers waver back and forth, the first tower, and then all of a sudden this massive dust cloud was coming my way, and it was falling. Now, at the moment, I assumed, really without thinking about it, that it was going to come tumbling down on me and everyone around me. So I remember grabbing two of my coworkers' hands, they were females, and then, I'll never forget this, my entire consciousness, it was the weirdest feeling. Scott Mason disappeared. It like shrunk into a little ball. And I remember it was like it was in the back of my head. There was nothing but a tunnel vision, circular, utterly, completely, with this just intense emotional focus on running to what was in front of me. I've never experienced that something before since, and I hadn't thought about the amygdala and the ego and all of these sorts of things as happening. And that's the sort of thing where I also wonder if a lot of times when organizations or a leader is otherwise in crisis, it might happen in less of a extreme way, but nonetheless be playing out, and to what extent even that is something worth being aware of giving into, or saying, okay, my amygdala might be really in protective overdrive here. What are your thoughts about all that?
Well, I think that when we are going through something like the example that you just mentioned, that is a traumatic event, right? So not only is your amygdala being kicked into gear because you know that immediately that response it's a reaction to, am I in danger?
Yeah.
That reaction then triggers, that tunnel vision of whoom, right? Like you're just going to go, you're going to get to somewhere safe. You're going to pull those hands of your coworkers and you're going to be like, whoa, let's go. Right. And you're not even thinking about it. It is a reaction to a scary or startling event. Right. And so your amygdala kicks into gear, just like your ego sometimes can kick into gear. Now, managing that amygdala is also part of managing how you deal with response versus reaction, right? So a lot of people, who have been through traumatic events have very high reactive responses. And so they startle really easily. There's hyper startling. There's, you can see it. And yet, just like, the correlation or the comparison is just like the ego, we can manage that. We can manage that. But if we choose not to, our egos can run away with us, right? They can get the better of us. And yet, I think that it's okay we're always as humans going to have an ego. We're always going to have an amygdala. And that's a good thing because they have there's a certain reason that they're there. However, to become more familiar with yourself and how you respond to things versus react to things will help manage that ego, will help manage your response to a given situation, right? But we have to be open to that, and that means learning.
What I'm hearing when I think about the story from a symbolic perspective and as a leadership allegory, I cannot help but conclude that she represents taking those steps to know yourself, right? Because if she didn't, then she would have led the cities that respected her or venerated her. She wouldn't have been able to help the heroes be able to solve their problems. A lot of how I interpret heroism, and I know I'm not the only one in this respect, is that heroism, at least from a mythical perspective, isn't necessarily something you automatically become. It's not even, I personally believe, a journey, although hardcore Joseph Campbell fans probably would believe that. I do believe it is an engagement with a transformational process that involves pulling your best self out. A hero being mentored by Athena, or any of the other gods, is a hero coming closer to their own inner God, to their own essence. It's my personal belief, and I urge all of my clients to move into this space, that if you really want to understand who and what you are and be the best leader that you can be, you need to understand the avatar, the mythical avatar that represents your higher self. Use it as your North Star, attempt to move to that, and ultimately you will embody the greatness that is within an Olympian. Nonetheless, thinking of times in which I've not known myself, Summer, right? Like you're talking about traumatic response. I have not been secret about the fact that on other shows that I've hosted, my childhood was very tough. It was very traumatic. My household was violent, often explosively, and for no apparent reason. Now, when I was in earlier executive positions in my life, people loved working for me, even if I was a jerk sometimes, because I would protect them. I would tell people, if there's a zombie apocalypse, you want me there. You'll be safe. I will relentlessly and ruthlessly destroy every zombie and everything that there is, and they will have no mercy, and you will be fine. And of course, staff loved having this protector figure there, but I didn't know myself well enough, A, to see that as what it truly was, which was an overactive response. B, that's not showing the sort of flexibility in terms of my responses to external stimuli that I needed to be in order to manifest or present an act as a great leader, which takes me to another thing that you said, which was the catnip earlier. I once read, you're the psychologist, not me though, but I once read that personality disorders, which you mentioned earlier, are really an overly limited set of reactions to external stimulus. Now, I'm not going to get up on this show and say I had a personality disorder, but I could have had a wider degree of responses to stimulus, and part of my shedding feathers, taking in the spirit of Athena, was learning about myself enough to know that this needed to change. But when it comes to embodying Athena in my job, for instance, mentoring people, I found it very difficult to mentor people that exhibited behaviors that were consistent with certain disorders. Or I also found it difficult to work for people that were all about them, or had this like callous affect, or had other issues that to me represented, again, a personality disorder, or some issue with how they were responding to the stimulus that they got as leaders. Am I the only person in the world who ever felt that way, Summer?
Scott, I think we've all been exposed to people who have strong personality traits, right? And so and that's what we call them. In the clinical world, you have traits, and we will put that on, on our write-up, like traits of AB, because those are the things that we're looking for based on their behavior, their explanation, their history, what, their reaction to things is, or a response to it is. So we look at those things and say, what traits do they have? It doesn't mean that they have to have the full-blown out disorder or personality disorder, right? And so that's why I think we all have traits. It's something that I mentioned earlier on, that I have a strong personality, and I had those certain traits because, like you, Scott, I was from, early on when I had to live with my father, he was highly abusive. And because of that, watching the trauma, being exposed to situations which created trauma in my life, and also being told, you need to get up, you need to do A, B, and C, and you need to just head through people and disregard and, and that wasn't me. Because here's another thing that I will mention. We have innate and learned abilities, right? We have something that's deep within us and we're born with. just maybe it's a leadership quality. Maybe it's that we are a good speaker. Maybe that, it could be anything. And we have these innate abilities. And then there are things that are learned. Well, some of the stuff in regards to what we were exposed to as children was learned, right? And then we were traumatized by some of that. And then from that, we knew we had to become survivors, right? So that's why, Scott, as a manager, as a director, was like, I've got you, because those skills that you learned, that you harnessed, that you held on to, were the safety mechanisms that you needed at that time. At that time, as Scott, as a little boy, right? And yet those followed you into your professional situation, your professional career. And yet today you stand here having done the work and we continue to do work on ourselves to have that those points of reflection and those points of learning where we understand better that that was a child that was trying to survive. That was an adult that was trying to survive and help others to survive, because you were scared. And if they're scared, you want to protect them. You want to protect your employees, right? From others that are going to hurt them. And so it makes sense. It makes sense. That's your reaction or your response to, I will protect you in the workplace. I will be that person to hold your hand, to get you out of that situation, to be behind you. And I think that's great that bosses can do it. But I think it's important that we look at, as you had mentioned, we look at where we're functioning from. And is that always the healthiest place for us? And are we being those flexible learners and flexible leaders to be able to engage others, to listen to new information, to embrace others' perspectives, and, just to work as a cohesive community together? What does that look like?
As you're saying all of that, particularly thinking about the relationship of childhood to how we manage and the skills that we end up developing, whether we want to or not sometimes. Athena, as I mentioned earlier, came out of Zeus's head an adult, fully clothed. And so I can't help but then think about that symbolism, the embodiment of wisdom emerging from the forehead of the chief leader, fully clothed and an adult, almost as an allegory for the process of developing into a fully effective, none of us are ever perfect, but sort of optimizing ourselves as leaders, correlating to, or maybe even being a completion of the process of moving from a child into an adult, not in a chronological or physical sense, but in an emotional and social sense.
Yeah, and I think too that as we evolve as humans, we have the choice. We have the choice to learn. We have the choice to recognize. I also think that there's something like Athena, there was something within her innate. That was something that was so deep, that was innate, that people saw her radiate as a leader. They saw her, and it was because it was something that was coming from within her, right? And I believe that we all have that too. My mom, let me give you an example. My mom, when I was young, at 6 months old, I had a hole in my small intestine and I almost died.
Oh,
And she said, Summer, she said, you struggled. Everything that I ate went, so just imagine this, 6-month-old baby, everything you were eating, was going through that hole. So it was creating chaos in my whole body. It was creating infection, or I was getting septic, right? And so she would take me to the doctor and they would say, no, nothing's wrong with her. She's got a cold. She's got the stomach flu. They just dismissed her, right? But here's my point in all of this. It's not just my mom's story, but what she said was, even while you were so sick, doctors didn't know what they could do. They couldn't do anything more. They were actually around the crib praying when she came into the room one
Oh
day.
my God.
And this was in
The
California.
doctors?
And the doctors, because they looked at her and said, you know what? This is the last thing we can do. We've done multiple surgeries. She's got to start healing. She's got to start thriving. And they said, we just have to pray for her now. And so my mom said, even when you were that sick and you had already been in a coma, she said, you were pinned down. You had your legs, your arms tied down because you had tubes coming. I had tubes coming out of my neck, out of my stomach. I had feeding tubes. I couldn't be fed without, being fed through a tube. And she said, you were still smiling. You were still kind. You were still happy. She said, I would come in and that heart monitor would start going, and it would start racing, getting excited. She's like, there's always been something within you to be kind, right? And there's something in young Scott that wanted to be that protector that was innate in you, that you wanted to protect others, and you have that kindness, right? And so I think there's people who are born with certain things just deeply within them. I mean, and from a clinical perspective, clinical side, I would be doing an assessment with a 5-year-old. It's just, and this happened more than once, maybe some young kid, and they would say something like, yeah, I would ask them because their parents would report on what the behavior was. And I would ask the kid without their parents being present. I said, did you actually hurt an animal, right? How did you hurt an animal? And they would have a flat affect, and they would say, well, I put it in the oven. And when it was live, and yes, I said, did you see anything wrong with that? No. And it was like, okay. And that's an extreme case. That is an extreme case of something we're looking at that was absolutely frightening, right? And yet it was, okay, I need to find out more. Maybe the influences behind this, what that kid did or did not know, what was being told, what kind of reaction he was trying to get. I mean, there were all kinds of questions I had at this point. But you say there's something that could be innate, learned, we need to figure ourselves out to be these functioning, effective, passionate leaders. But what does that mean? And if we don't know ourselves, how are we supposed to give that to somebody else?
Summer, I was going to say something, but I completely forgot what it was with that story. I have many reactions. Look, we all know these things happen. It's just not every day that, someone says, I actually was having a conversation with someone who did it. But that's reality.
There were a lot of, when you work in mental health and you work in this hospitals and there's a lot that happens. There's a lot that goes on, and you are exposed to a lot of different things, and you have to do quick analysis and assessment. And so again, like Athena, she was a strategist. She was somebody who could assess and strategize. And that's what we did. And one of the best things that I've done throughout my career is work in an emergent triage hospital where people were coming in the front door, in the back door. They were being brought in by emergency workers, from police to law enforcement to firefighters, so you had to be on your toes, you had to work as a team, and you worked quickly.
There was a book I read in a different phase of my life called The Sociopath Next Door. It was by an author named Martha Stout. I also hear that she's written a sequel that's sort of a survival guide. And in any event, it was covering people who were, she sort of used the words interchangeably, sociopath and psychopath. I don't know to what extent, I'm not a clinician, so I don't know to what extent that's correct or not. But one of the things she pointed out was that the organizational incentives that the current social, economic, political environment has organizations operating within encourage psychopathy or sociopathy at the highest level. And I can't help but think, look, Athena would never in a million years just go and kill an owl for no reason, right? Or stick
Yeah.
anything in the oven. She might have to, as a goddess of war, destroy something because of a larger strategic objective she had that was just, for instance, defending the city from attackers. You might have to kill the soldiers that are attacking you. But, right, as distasteful as that is, that's not so unreasonable. But, you know, when we talk about community, then this is raising another issue that I hadn't really thought about, which is, okay, we have an environment where organizations are communities and they operate within communities, and the employees, whether you like it or not, are a community, a dysfunctional community, a demoralized community, or an engaged and excited and productive community. And,
Right.
you know, thinking about all of, and then companies make choices about whether they want to be responsive to the external communities or not, and which communities they want to be responsive to. And so I can't help but think that, you know, when it comes to a lot of the other themes of Athena, thinking strategically, thinking about the psychological inputs, the traumas or the events that you were raised in, going back to Adler for a minute, that might influence who and what you become or how you respond to the circumstances from an organizational perspective. What are thoughts you might have about how someone can mentor someone who is exhibiting traits like this, even if as just some random employee or leader in an organization, you're in no way qualified to make an assessment, nor even if you were, would you be able to do anything about it? And then to what extent do you feel like safeguards or checks or that sort of thing can exist through a mentoring or other process to curb the risk of these sorts of personalities ending up at the top and inflicting damage? Because as I understand it, as this book presented it, a psychopath or a sociopath is almost inherently anti-community building. They're not.
So from a clinical perspective, we really call those folks who are deemed psychopath more antisocial. So that's the clinical term. Is this person meeting criteria for the antisocial personality disorder? And it isn't somebody who is asocial. That is very different than being a clinically deemed antisocial personality disorder. So, and I'll leave it to the listeners and the viewers to look that up and see the difference there. But when we are actually diagnosing, that's the term that we use, right? And so there are variables to that, right? And again, people might have traits to that anti-personality disorder. They don't have to be a full-blown out or a narcissist, right? Narcissist, you know, a narcissistic disorder, or, you know, it's their traits. I think we all have traits. This is why I go back to take time. Take time as a leader or somebody who is learning to be a leader. Take time to work on oneself. As you take time to reflect, you take time to understand where you came from, your feelings, understanding your feelings, identifying your feelings, it's going to make you more of an understanding, empathic leader. And I think that's where we start on the track of healthy leadership, right? When I used to go into groups, or when I used to go into community and work with groups of people, whether it's anger management, whether it was communication skills, whatever the group was, I always started it out with, and this is going to sound kind of funny, with a sheet of paper. And you know those little emojis on our
Yeah.
phones? It had those different faces of happy, angry, sad, disgruntled, and I'd have them pick out or identify how they were feeling that day. And the reason being is, you know, people might go, oh God, here she is again with her sheet of paper with all these little faces, right? And it was because we could better identify the feelings and be able to name them. And when we identify how we're feeling and begin to talk about that, begin to name those feelings, it makes us a more in tune, effective, attached communication to other people, right? Not in a bad way, not in an enmeshed way, but more of a understanding way where we are reflecting on who are we, how are we feeling, and how are we influencing others, and how are we supporting others? Because as a leader, we are always modeling by what we say, by what we do, by what we show, by how we interact with others. That is leadership. We are models. And so to be more familiar with oneself and how you are responding, not reacting, but how you are responding to a given situation, because reaction is different than a
Yeah.
response, right? A reaction is just going full blown into that like fight or flight mode, right? Whereas a response is thinking strategically about your goals and what do you want from the interaction that is actually occurring at that time, or an interaction that will be incurring, you will incur. So what is the end goal to that you're looking for? It's an opportunity to take the time to be more strategic, to be more empathic, to understand self and where you want to be in that response. That is what a leader is. A leader is taking those steps to better and understand oneself, to be part of a bigger context, to be part of a community. Because if you don't understand yourself and you're just reacting all the time, is that good leadership? And see, here's the thing, Scott, we are going into it. We have come into 2025. There have been a lot of changes for our communities in regards to COVID, now a new administration, and a lot of the influences in business come from our federal government, what they see being modeled,
Yeah.
right? Whether or not that's remote work, whether or not that is, a program where they're considering going into the office or having a mix of remote work and going into that, whatever that is, right? So that's just an example where people are looking at what's happening in the federal government. And that kind of trickles down. It's kind of like that pebble in the water with those concentric circles, right? You throw the pebble in the water, you get those concentric circles, and it's kind of like the model that affects everything, right? Whether it's nonprofit, where they get their funding, some of it is from government, whether or not it's private sector, where they're looking at, hey, what's the model now? What's the model doing? Well, it's going to be an influence. And because of that influence, there are a lot of changes coming. And I say this because, as being a team member for the Core Mentorship Solutions program, we're going to see a lot of changes. And that's why mentorship, leadership, this program is so important, because we're going to help you before major issues arise, to help you transition and help your workforce transition better, where they have a better understanding of the other generation, because it is a cross-generational mentorship program. And I find that it's so important because, with that said, all these generations come with their own ideology, their own values, their own ways of functioning. And we need to better understand each other, break down those silos of communication, build up that more effective communication, understand and be open to new learning, new knowledge, and innovation.
Circles right back to what we talked about at the beginning of the hour. Athena mentored heroes, mortals that were of a generation. Mortals were created by the gods, so they were a generation after the gods. And then she mentored Zeus, who was the generation before her, as well as was generally perceived as the wisest of the deities within her own generation. And she provided guidance that was helpful. She wasn't always, though, cheerleading. And thinking about effective mentoring, she also, as the goddess of wisdom, sent very firm messages. If those that were not following the path of wisdom, right? If they chose to go their own way. So a famous story is the one of Arachne. Athena had mentored Arachne, a mortal woman, on the artistry of loomcraft. And Arachne became so good at it that she started to brag that she was even better than Athena herself. Now, I have found in organizational politics, don't go around bragging that you're better than your boss. Or you do, just go home and tell your spouse that, but don't tell everyone in the whole world. And so Athena heard about it. She and Arachne had a contest to see who would weave a better carpet or a better tapestry, I think. And the Arachne tapestry was one ridiculing the gods, making fun of their affairs or making them look like jerks or portraying incidents of stupidity or foolishness. Athena's understandably was more respectful of the universal hierarchy. And basically, when Athena saw what Arachne had done, she made it clear that this was not going to be tolerated in her organization, or the organization of Zeus, which I consider sort of equivalent to an enterprise. And she ripped up Arachne's tapestry, and Arachne tried to kill herself in humiliation. Athena wasn't going to let that happen. She revived Arachne and turned her into the world's first spider. And we all know Arachne and her descendants continue to weave to this day spider webs. But that's also one of those things we might not want to be necessarily as harsh as Athena was with Arachne in current organizations. But part of mentoring to me is also understanding, teaching people. You mentioned earlier the example of like staying home from work. With COVID, there's an entire generation of people that entered the workforce that have had no background in working in a location with team members, or if they did, it was so long ago that they kind of forgot it. Maybe they worked for 2 years or something, then they were working remotely for years afterwards. And so I also see the role viewed a little bit, again, less aggressively than Athena might have, but of a mentor as giving direction and caution about what you don't want to do. And a modern example might be, don't send that email ridiculing your boss and condescending your boss to the entire organization. Don't.
Yeah. Don't do it. So there's so many things that you just said there, and I want to touch on a few of those things. So when there was that example given about Arachne, thinking she was a better loomer than Athena, there's the ego.
Yeah, I guess
Here's where the ego starts setting in, right? And it's, how do you know that you are skilled and you're good at what you do, but does that mean that the ego has to be infused in a way that into the situation in a way that it's negatively impacting others, right? And so there's where that awareness comes in, where you can be a great loomer. You can be somebody who does great work, but is there always a place for, oh, I'm better than, right? It's how are you looking at your own ego? And here's the thing, when we talk about KMS or core mentorship solutions, I know that there are going to be systems in place with a different hierarchical structure, right? I've been exposed to many. One of those micro cultures is the military.
Mm-hmm.
And although I wasn't a service member, I was a spouse of a service member for 21 years to a Marine, right? And so that didn't just mean, oh, you marry this person and, oh, they have their job and you have yours. No, that is a completely different culture where you're moving every 3 years. And this was not what I envisioned as my trajectory in my life, but you're moving every 3 years, especially in my professional view of who I was and where I wanted to be. So the movies that really that I attached to growing up were Baby Boom, Working Girl, 9 to 5. That was the perception I had of women in the workforce, right? So it's like you stay with the job, you get tenure, you get that office high up in the sky, have a huge window. That's what I wanted, right? And that's not exactly how it rolled out as a military spouse.
Imagine. Yeah.
And so it was a microculture. So having to maneuver within that culture, what did that mean? What did that look like for me? But what did that look like for my family, which is also another system that I had to look at and function within. So I had a family system that I was, kind of juggling within this microculture, which was the Marine Corps, which was the military. So that meant we moved around, we got orders, we listened to those orders, and they had a hierarchical structure. Now, the military wife many times felt like she was down at the bottom, but in actuality, she was helping. She was part of that foundation where she was helping support the mission for the military, right? And so, and I can go back into a long history of that because I've done a lot of research in that as well, but I'm not going to at this point. But the awareness of cultures, be it military, be it those professional cultures, those communities of work cultures, workplace cultures, they're all a microculture of sorts. And so how are you understanding that culture? What's the there can be a hierarchical structure, but for KMS, it is a horizontal structure. We're coming in as a company to help your company from a horizontal
Mm.
perspective, which means that we're really trying to take the ego out where there used to be in a traditional mentorship model, something like the mentor and the mentee. We're doing away with the whole idea of mentee because I believe that every single person can be a mentor. It may be that that young person has never worked in an office space where they don't know not just strategy, but the protocol of how to work with a group of folks in a setting like that, in a work setting. So they're going to need somebody with a little bit more wisdom and a little bit of experience to help them along, right? But those younger folks are also coming with innovation. They're coming with an ability to shift quickly because they've been exposed to technology that, guess what, has shifted quickly. So guess what? They picked up skills along the way where they know how to transition pretty darn quickly. So they're also going to transition if they're not happy. That means they're going to transition out of a job,
Yeah.
right? Or they're going to leave.
Yeah.
Or they're going to end. We don't want to see that happen because we know they have an incredible skill set and we know they come with passion, but how can we as different generations start hearing each other, start being more empathic, starting working from a horizontal framework rather than a hierarchical framework? So
Athena represents, as we've mentioned a few times, strategy, which from a human perspective within an organization does involve managing microcultures, both of the external stakeholders of whatever organization you're involved with, but even the microcultures within that organization, which might be the individual divisions or units or cliques or whatever affinity groups there might be. And then you're also talking about agility and that particular value that younger people can bring to older people many times, that is also related to the overall strategic ability of a company to function in a world that is more rapidly shifting than ever, and goes as to both Athena's overall responsibility around strategy, but also her military strategy function in particular, because as a military spouse, and anyone who's, for instance, read any sort of military literature, including, I might add, the Iliad, battle lines, military situations can shift very quickly. And so the ability to be agile is invaluable. Summer, we have covered so much. This literally could go on for another 3 hours, and I still feel like we would just touch the surface. But one of the things that will stick with me forever about this conversation is this idea of the artistic representation of Athena changing over time from a bird into a fully glorious human, who, by the way, when she came out of Zeus's head, was so glorious that she stopped the sun itself. He himself stopped what he was doing and looked at her, right? And then was able to embody all of these different functions that represented ultimately her ability to do things like build community, be the protectress of entire metropolises, help organizations, these cities, with their strategy, and ultimately have enough insight to be able to, with her feathers shed, still be able to hold on to the owl, that person that she might have been before she was able to step fully into this community-based embodiment of wisdom. Summer, if there's one thing that you would like to take away for the audience right now, or that you haven't had a chance to say that you want to, what would that be?
when I think about some of the things that we've talked about today, and I think about going back to the example you had given in And I also gave an example of being that young Scott or that young Summer and being exposed to certain things and things that were traumatic. We're always going to have that that young Scott or that young Summer inside of us, right? That's always going to be there. But rather than push away or be reactive as young Scott or young Summer maybe would have, how do we nurture that part of us? How do we say, it's okay? You're here to not survive anymore, but to thrive. And that is about doing some self-reflection. You know, when I look at or hear the phrase self-actualization, sometimes people will go, well, I'm completely self-actualized. And I'm like, wait, we have the opportunity to continue to self-actualize until we are
I was gonna say,
gone.
who are these people?
Like, oh yeah, oh God, who said that to you? Well, I've had some people say
On the
that to
topic
me.
of
And
ego.
I said, and I thought to myself, you know, it's important that we as individuals and as a community, remember, there's always opportunity to grow. There's always an opportunity to self-actualize as individuals and as communities. And again, what's so nice about core mentorship solutions, it really does infuse a lot of these principles that we've talked about today, the principles that Athena functioned from as well. And they infuse that psychology of Alfred Adler, who you know, thought about community and how important it was and how it influenced the things that we did and how we came together and how we heard each other, how we grew together, that he turned it into a philosophy. He turned it into a theoretical practice. He turned it into something we could use and we could help each other and support each other with. And so that's what's also infused into this program. So when I think about, you know, something I could give to someone today is, remember, continue to be open to learning about oneself as well as how can you help others, you know, grow and learn about themselves and as an individual and as a community.
Like Athena's spear, that went right to my heart.
Oh,
Summer,
that's
how
awesome.
can people find out more about you? We've mentioned KMS and we have the link in the caption below, but tell us, where would you, people are going to want to hear this and going to want to connect with you. Where should they go and where exactly should they look with all the choices that they have to find out more about you to really learn about KMS and what you're doing?
KMS is a program under the domain of Core Women LLC. And so you can go to 𝗘𝗅𝗍women.com and you can check out Core Women, more about me, as well as the KMS program and my core team. Which is an incredible core team. Thank you, Scott, for being on the team.
You're
And
busting.
you can also go and find out about the Core Women podcast, which is on all the different podcast platforms. And you can reach me on LinkedIn at Summer Watson, MHS PhD, and you can also go follow Core Women on Instagram.
Thank you. By the way, just before we go, is it true that the Core Women podcast recently hit a listenership milestone, like maybe top something percent or another?
Top 3% globally?
Yeah. Don't let that slide by. I know we're talking about controlling our ego, but give yourself. I'm gonna give you a brag because that is quite an accomplishment.
Aw, thank you. I really appreciate it. It took 7 years, but you know, I feel like for me, the most important thing about that is that this podcast is being heard, which means that every single person, and let me tell you, there have been, let me see, how many episodes thus far? 341 episodes, 341 women, and I did have an episode with men that particular, you know, this podcast is being heard around the world and those stories are being heard. And to me, that means a lot because there again, that was created to support community.
I wonder if Athena would have been a core woman.
She absolutely would have been. She would have been the core woman.
Thank you so much. If you all have enjoyed this episode, make sure that you press the thumbs up button below, share this episode with folks, leave a comment. If you have additional mythological figures that you'd like me to discuss elsewhere on this channel or to have a guest come and speak about, please leave that as well. And then also if you have questions or want to just give your feedback about everything that you've seen or heard today, the comments are there just waiting for your engagement. I care about you, and I want to have a conversation with any and everyone who watches this show. In the meantime, be sure to show the channel some love by pressing the subscribe button, and then above all else, come back again next time for another chit chat at the Myth Slayer Café.